15-second hook. There are moments in life when the silence feels louder than any scream. When you pray into the darkness and wonder if God has turned away. This is the story of a man who lost everything. His job, his home, and the people he trusted, and believed God had abandoned him. Until one ordinary moment revealed a truth that changed everything. The night the rain came through the cracked ceiling of his car, Daniel stopped praying. He had tried to hold on longer than most people would have. Even when the email came, the one with the polite language and the sharp finality, he had whispered, "It's okay, God. I trust you." Even when the rent notice followed a month later, red ink bleeding through the envelope, he had knelt beside his bed and asked for strength instead of rescue. Even when his phone stopped lighting up with familiar names, when friends grew distant and conversations turned awkward and brief, he still folded his hands every night and believed someone was listening. But that night, parked behind a closed grocery store with rain tapping against the windshield like impatient fingers, something inside him went quiet. Daniel leaned his forehead against the steering wheel and laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because the sound felt safer than crying. He was 39 years old, sleeping in his car, wearing the same jacket for the third week in a row. The job he had worked at for 12 years was gone. The apartment he thought he'd grow old in belonged to someone else now. And the people who once promised, "If you ever need anything, call me," had slowly stopped answering. He whispered into the empty car, "I don't know how to do this anymore." No thunder answered. No warmth filled his chest. No gentle reassurance came. Just rain. Just cold. Just silence. That was the night he decided to stop asking God for help. Mornings became mechanical after that. Daniel woke up stiff and disoriented, took a moment to remember where he was, then sat up and rubbed his face with both hands like he could wipe away the truth. He used the bathroom at a gas station a mile away, splashed water on his face, and stared at his reflection like it belonged to someone else. His beard had grown uneven. His eyes looked dull. He barely recognized the man staring back. "You did everything right," he muttered one morning. "You worked hard. You showed up. You believed." The reflection didn't answer. He spent his days walking. Libraries when they were open. Park benches when the weather allowed. Sometimes he watched people through coffee shop windows, laughing, complaining, living, and wondered when life had quietly moved on without him. He avoided churches now. Not because he hated God, but because stepping inside felt like standing outside a locked door and pretending it wasn't locked. At night, when exhaustion finally dragged him into shallow sleep, memories crept in. His father teaching him how to ride a bike. His mother praying over him before school. The way faith used to feel simple, like breathing. He would wake up with his chest tight and turn his face toward the window, staring at the stars he barely noticed anymore. If God was still there, Daniel couldn't feel him. One afternoon, weeks later, Daniel sat on a bench outside the public library, turning a folded piece of paper over and over in his hands. It was his resume, creased, smudged, outdated. He had walked into 3 places that day. 3 polite smiles. 3 versions of, "We'll call you." They never did. He stood up, suddenly angry, and shoved the paper into his pocket. "What's the point?" he said aloud, earning a glance from a woman passing by. He didn't care. Anger felt better than numbness. At least anger meant he was still alive. Daniel walked without direction, his shoes scuffing the sidewalk, until he realized he was hungry. Not the dull hunger he had grown used to, but the sharp, dizzy kind that made his hands shake. He checked his wallet, $2 and some change. Not enough for anything meaningful. He stopped in front of a small diner, the kind that still had vinyl booths and handwritten specials taped to the window. The smell of fried food drifted out as someone opened the door, and his stomach twisted painfully. Daniel turned away, ashamed of the way his mouth watered. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice behind him. "Hey, sir." Daniel froze. He didn't turn around right away. Experience had taught him that being noticed usually came with embarrassment. Finally he looked back. A young woman stood in the doorway of the diner, holding a paper bag. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her apron was stained, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "You okay?" she asked, not in the forced way people sometimes did, but gently, like she actually wanted to know. "I'm fine," Daniel said quickly. Too quickly. She hesitated, then held out the bag. "We had an extra sandwich. It'll just get tossed if no one takes it." Daniel stared at the bag like it might disappear if he reached for it. Pride rose up instinctively. He opened his mouth to refuse. Then his stomach growled, loud and traitorous. The woman smiled softly. "Please." He took the bag with shaking hands. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking despite his effort to keep it steady. She nodded. "You're welcome. Take care of yourself, okay?" Daniel walked away before she could say anything else. He sat on the curb around the corner and opened the bag. A warm sandwich. Still fresh. He took a bite and closed his eyes as tears spilled down his cheeks. It wasn't the food that broke him. It was the kindness. As he ate, something stirred deep inside him, an uncomfortable thought he tried to push away. He hadn't asked for help. He hadn't prayed. He hadn't even spoken. And yet here it was. Provision. Ordinary. Unexpected. He shook his head. "Coincidence," he muttered. "Just coincidence." But the word didn't sit right. That night, back in his car, Daniel found himself doing something he hadn't done in weeks. He folded his hands, not in prayer exactly, more like habit, and stared at the dashboard. "If that was you," he said quietly, "I don't understand why you waited." The silence returned. But this time it felt different. Not empty. Just patient. Days passed. Then more days. Daniel began to notice things he had ignored before. A man on the bus who paid his fare without a word. A librarian who slipped him information about a job training program and smiled like she already believed he could do it. A woman at the shelter who remembered his name. None of it was dramatic. None of it erased the hardship. But it was steady. Consistent. Like footsteps beside him he had been too tired to notice. One evening, as Daniel sat watching the sunset bleed orange across the sky, a memory surfaced. Something his mother used to say when he was young. "God doesn't always calm the storm," she'd tell him. "Sometimes he holds you while it passes." Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. Not because his situation had changed. Not because answers had suddenly appeared. But because a quiet truth was beginning to form, fragile but real. Maybe God hadn't abandoned him after all. Maybe he had been there the whole time. Daniel didn't notice the change all at once. It wasn't like waking up to sunlight after a stormy night. It was more like realizing halfway through the day that the ache in your chest isn't as sharp as it used to be. The morning after the sandwich, he woke up before his alarm. The sky was still gray, the kind of gray that didn't promise anything but didn't threaten rain either. He sat in the driver's seat of his car, hands resting on his thighs, and breathed. For a long moment, he just listened to the quiet hum of the city beginning to stir. Normally mornings came with dread. Today there was something else mixed in. Curiosity maybe. Or caution. Like part of him was waiting to see if yesterday had been a fluke. He drove to the gas station, washed his face, and caught his reflection again. The same tired eyes stared back, but they looked alert. As if they were paying attention. Daniel spent that day doing what he usually did. Walking, scanning notice boards, stepping into places where he knew the answer would probably be no. At a community center near the edge of downtown. He lingered longer than usual. A flyer on the door caught his eye. Job skills workshop, free. Lunch provided. He almost laughed. "Of course," he murmured. Food again. Inside, the room smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. About a dozen people sat in folding chairs, some scrolling on their phones, others staring ahead with the same worn-out expression Daniel knew too well. He took a seat in the back, telling himself he could leave any time. A man in his 50s stood at the front, sleeves rolled up, voice steady and calm. He talked about resumes, interviews, confidence. Things Daniel used to teach new hires back when he had been the one with stability. The irony wasn't lost on him. During the break, boxed lunches were handed out. Daniel took one, nodded his thanks, and sat quietly. Across from him, a woman with short gray hair smiled. "First time here?" she asked. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "You?" "Third," she said, unapologetic. "Takes a few tries to sink in. Or maybe I'm just stubborn." He smiled back, surprised at how easy it felt. They talked about nothing important: weather, traffic, bad coffee. When the session ended, she wished him luck and meant it. As Daniel stepped outside, he felt that strange sensation again. The one that made him uneasy and comforted at the same time. Someone once told him that when you're drowning, help doesn't always look like a lifeboat. Sometimes it looks like floating debris. Small, barely enough to hold onto, but enough to keep you alive until morning. That night, sitting in his car, Daniel found himself speaking into the quiet again. Not a full prayer. Just words. "Okay," he said softly. "I see it. A little." He didn't expect an answer. But the tightness in his chest eased, just a fraction. The following weeks were uneven. Some days hope felt close enough to touch. Other days it slipped through his fingers like smoke. There were nights when the cold crept in and doubt followed close behind. "You're reading into things," he told himself one night as he pulled his jacket tighter. "People are just being people. That's all." But the thought didn't fully convince him. One afternoon, Daniel was walking past a church he hadn't noticed before. It was small, tucked between a laundromat and a closed-down bookstore. The sign out front was simple. "Open. Come in." He stopped. His feet felt heavy, like they were rooted to the sidewalk. The idea of stepping inside made his stomach twist. He didn't feel worthy, or ready, or brave. "You don't belong in there anymore," a voice in his head whispered. Sounded suspiciously like his own. Daniel turned to leave, then paused. He thought of the sandwich, the workshop, the small kindnesses that kept appearing even when he wasn't looking for them. Before he could overthink it, he pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and lemon cleaner. A handful of people sat scattered among the pews. No one turned to stare. No one whispered. Daniel slid into a seat near the back and kept his head down. The pastor spoke quietly, without theatrics. He talked about wilderness seasons. About how even Jesus had experienced silence. About how faith wasn't proven by certainty, but by endurance. Daniel's throat tightened. At the end, the pastor said, "If you feel like God is distant, it doesn't mean he's gone. Sometimes it means he's closer than ever, teaching you how to walk without seeing the whole path." Daniel stayed seated long after others left. When he finally stood, the pastor approached him, not with questions but with a nod. "Glad you came," he said. "Me too," Daniel replied, surprised to realize he meant it. Life didn't magically fix itself after that. Daniel still slept in his car. He still faced rejection. There were days when old anger flared up without warning. One particularly bad evening, he found himself shouting into the empty air. "If you're there, why is this taking so long? What are you waiting for?" His voice cracked, and the anger drained out, leaving only exhaustion. "I'm tired," he whispered. The answer didn't come as words. Came as a memory. Himself weeks earlier, curled in the driver's seat, soaked by rain, certain he was abandoned. And himself now, still struggling, still uncertain, but standing, breathing, moving forward. He hadn't collapsed. He hadn't disappeared. Somehow he was still here. That realization followed him into the next day, when the phone rang unexpectedly. An unfamiliar number. Daniel stared at it, heart pounding. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Hi, this is Mark from the community center," the voice said. "You attended the workshop a few weeks ago. We have a temporary position opening up. It's not permanent yet, but it's something. Are you interested?" Daniel had to sit down. "Yes," he said quickly. Yes, absolutely. When the call ended, he laughed and cried at the same time, hands shaking. It wasn't a career. It wasn't security. But it was a door. That night he finally prayed again. Not for rescue. Not for explanations. Just gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly. For staying. The silence remained, but now it felt full, like a room where someone else was breathing. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Daniel allowed himself to believe something he had been too afraid to say out loud. God never left. He had simply been walking beside him, step by step, through the valley. Daniel's first day at the community center job didn't feel triumphant. There were no dramatic speeches, no swelling music, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was a folding table, a borrowed name badge, and a stack of forms that needed to be sorted before noon. But when Daniel clipped the badge to his jacket and saw his name printed clearly, Daniel Harper, something inside him shifted. For months he had felt invisible, reduced to a problem that needed fixing. Now, at least for a few hours a day, he was someone again. Person with a task. A reason to show up. Morning, a woman said as she passed him in the hallway. Morning, Daniel replied, surprised by how natural it sounded. The work was simple. Answering phones. Directing people to the right offices. Filing papers. Yet every small responsibility felt enormous. He focused intently, afraid that if he made a mistake, the opportunity would vanish. During lunch, he sat alone at first, unwrapping a sandwich from a brown paper bag. He paused, smiling faintly at the memory of the diner weeks earlier. Food had become a marker of grace in his life. Unassuming, necessary, quietly provided. A man named Carlos slid into the chair across from him. You're new, right? Yeah, Daniel said. Welcome to the chaos, Carlos joked. Don't worry. It looks messy, but most of us are just figuring it out as we go. Daniel chuckled. That makes two of us. As the days passed, Daniel noticed how easily stories. People came through the doors carrying more than paperwork. They carried fear, regret, hope they were almost embarrassed to admit. And as Daniel listened, really listened, he realized something unexpected. He understood them. Not academically, not theoretically, but deeply. He knew what it felt like to lose ground, to wake up unsure where you belonged, to wonder if your best days were already behind you. And because he knew, people opened up to him in ways they didn't with others. One afternoon, a man about Daniel's age sat across from him, hands clasped tightly. I used to think faith meant things would work out, the man said quietly. Now I'm not so sure. Daniel hesitated. Then he spoke honestly. I used to think that too. I don't anymore. The man looked up, eyes searching. So what do you think now? Daniel considered the question. I think faith means you're not walking alone. Even when it feels like you are. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to comfort the man. That evening, Daniel returned to his car, tired but steady. He stared at the ceiling, listening to distant traffic, and realized he hadn't once asked, why me? That day. Instead, he found himself asking a different question. What if this matters? Weeks turned into a month. The temporary job was extended. Not promised but hopeful. Daniel saved what little he could. A coworker told him about a room for rent. Nothing fancy but warm and safe. The first night he slept there, on a mattress on the floor, Daniel lay staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it hum softly. He expected relief to wash over him. Instead, tears came. Not from joy alone but from release. I didn't think I'd make it here, he whispered. The silence answered him the way it had before. Not empty, not distant. Present. One Sunday morning, Daniel returned to the small church. He sat closer to the front this time. When the pastor spoke about unseen faithfulness, about how God works in the waiting, not just the arrival, Daniel felt the words settle into him like something finding its rightful place. After the service, an older man approached him. You look familiar, he said. I've been coming a little while, Daniel replied. The man nodded. Good. Keep coming. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Life still tested him. There were moments when fear crept back in, whispering that everything could collapse again. But now Daniel recognized that voice for what it was. Fear, not truth. One night, sitting on his mattress, Daniel opened a Bible someone at the church had given him. It fell open to a passage he hadn't planned to read. I will never leave you nor forsake you. He stared at the words until they blurred. For so long, he had believed abandonment was proof of God's absence. Now he was beginning to understand something deeper. Sometimes survival itself is the miracle. Sometimes the fact that you're still standing is the evidence you've been carried. Daniel closed the Bible and leaned back, breathing deeply. He thought of the rain-soaked night in the car, of the sandwich, of the job, of the quiet strength that had grown in him without his permission. Thank you, he said again, softer this time. Not because everything was perfect, but because he was no longer alone in the imperfect. Part 4. Daniel's life didn't suddenly become easy once he had a room and a job. In some ways, the stability made old wounds more noticeable. When you're surviving, there's no time to feel everything. When you finally stop running, the weight of what you've been carrying has a way of catching up with you. Some nights, Daniel lay awake long after the ceiling fan stopped spinning, staring into the dark. Memories came uninvited. The day he was laid off. The awkward silences from friends who didn't know what to say and eventually stopped trying. The phone calls he never returned because shame had made his voice feel foreign in his own throat. He had learned how to keep moving. What he hadn't learned yet was how to heal. One evening after work, Daniel sat on the edge of his mattress, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of someone cooking down the hall. The smell of onions and oil drifted through the air, oddly comforting. I don't know how to forgive this, he said aloud. I don't know how to forgive them. Or myself. The words hung there, heavy. For a long time, Daniel had believed that faith meant suppressing questions, swallowing anger, pretending everything was fine. Now he was beginning to understand that real faith made room for truth, even when that truth was messy. The next day at work, a woman named Ruth came in asking for help with housing paperwork. She was nervous, her hands shaking as she spoke. I keep messing this up, she said, her voice tight. I'm tired of feeling like I'm failing at everything. Daniel looked at her and saw himself months earlier sitting in his car, convinced he was beyond repair. You're not failing, he said gently. You're just tired. She blinked, surprised. You think so? I know so, he replied. As he helped her fill out the forms, Daniel realized something profound. The compassion he was offering her was the same compassion he had refused to give himself. Somewhere along the way, he had decided his worth was tied to his success, his usefulness, his ability to stay strong. But strength, he was learning, didn't always look like standing tall. Sometimes it looked like admitting you were wounded and letting someone see it. That Sunday, Daniel stayed after church. The sanctuary was nearly empty when he approached the pastor, his heart pounding. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. Of course, the pastor replied. Daniel hesitated, then spoke. How do you trust God when you're still angry? The pastor didn't answer right away. He sat down in one of the pews and gestured for Daniel to join him. You don't wait until the anger is gone, he said finally. You bring it with you. God's not afraid of it. Daniel swallowed hard. What if I don't feel forgiven? Forgiveness isn't always a feeling, the pastor said. Sometimes it's a decision you make again and again until your heart catches up. That night, Daniel walked home slowly, hands in his pockets, the city lights flickering around him. He thought about all the moments he had mistaken God's silence for rejection. All the times he had assumed being alone meant being abandoned. He stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, and felt a sudden wave of emotion rise in his chest. What if you were there every time, he whispered. Even when I was too angry to notice. The thought unsettled him, and comforted him at the same time. Weeks later, the community center held a small appreciation event for volunteers and staff. Nothing formal. Just pizza, folding chairs, and conversation. Daniel stood near the wall at first, content to observe. Carlos clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got a way with people," he said. "You know that." Daniel shrugged. "I just listen." "Exactly," Carlos replied. "That's rarer than you think." As Daniel watched people laugh and talk, he felt something unfamiliar. Gratitude without fear. For a long time, every good thing had felt temporary, like it could vanish at any second. Now he was learning to receive moments without bracing for impact. Later that night, alone in his room, Daniel opened his Bible again. This time he didn't search for reassurance. He let the pages fall where they may. The words spoke of endurance, of refining fire, of a God who walks with his people through valleys, not around. Daniel leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. "I see it now," he said quietly. "You weren't punishing me. You were teaching me how to survive without pretending I didn't hurt." Tears came, not sharp, desperate ones but steady and honest. The next morning, Daniel received an email from Mark at the community center. The temporary position was becoming permanent. It wasn't glamorous. The pay wasn't impressive, but it was stable. Daniel read the message twice, then closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Not for the job alone, but for the journey that had changed him. That evening, Daniel called his sister for the first time in months. The conversation was awkward at first, then emotional, then healing in its own imperfect way. "I didn't know how to help you," she admitted. "I didn't know how to ask," Daniel replied. They stayed on the phone longer than either expected. As Daniel hung up, he realized something else had shifted. He no longer saw his broken season as wasted time. It had reshaped him, softened him, made room for empathy where pride once lived. Faith, he now understood, wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about discovering you were never alone inside it. That night, as Daniel turned off the light, he felt a quiet assurance settle over him. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. God had never abandoned him. He had been patiently, faithfully present, through every unanswered prayer, every closed door, every tear shed in the dark. And now, Daniel was finally learning how to see him. If this story spoke to you, know this: you are not forgotten. Even in your quietest prayers, even in the moments when faith feels heavy, God is closer than you realize. Sometimes He doesn't remove the valley, but He walks with you through it, step by step. If you're in a season where heaven feels silent, don't give up. Your story isn't over. What feels like abandonment may actually be God holding you together in ways you can't yet see. Thank you for listening. If this message encouraged you, take a moment to reflect, to breathe, and to remember: you are never alone. God never abandons.